Hi, this is Mike Dierks, Regional Home Missionary Coordinator of the Presbytery of Ohio. And today we have a special guest, the current General Secretary of Kimchi, who soon, assuming the approval from the Presbytery, will be moving to the Ohio Presbytery to Grace Church in Columbus as their minister, the pastor of outreach and evangelism. So, John, welcome.
Mike, it's great to be with you, and it's exciting to think about going back to Ohio.
So. Yeah, we're excited to have you here. So I know you've been doing this 10 years as the General Secretary. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years. But I want you to reflect back over those 10 years. We've seen significant changes in the culture that we live in. Talk about how church planning has been affected by that, how we've adjusted, all around the fact that the gospel is still the gospel.
Yeah, and I think this sort of falls under lessons learned, which I've really been thinking a lot about. What have I learned, and how does that help me grow in faith and in ministry? I always want to start here. It's important for me to start here. Part of what I've learned, which is something I've known and professed for decades, but I've seen on a big scale, is that no matter what's happening in the culture, we serve a big God, the creator and sustainer of all things. I always love to think about this, but he said, "Let there be light," and immediately there was light. And he's the same God, as we read in 2 Corinthians, who shines light into dark hearts and causes blind people to see. And so part of what I've been privileged to see in a bigger scale than most pastors do, because I'm traveling around a lot, is to see the bigness and greatness of our God on display. And that doesn't change even when cultures change and when opposition increases or decreases. We still serve the same God, and he's a God who's about saving people. And he leads us in a spiritual battle. And so we can go in with confidence. And so I never want to lose sight of that, because it's too easy to see cultural shifts that are discouraging and forget that the God we serve never changes. And that's just a big, important truth that I need to keep in mind. And because we know that to be true, we also know that he gives gifts to his church. So what I've seen in 10 years of doing this and working with, probably, I'd have to go back and look, but I would guess about 100 church planners that I've worked with over 10 years, because we roughly see 10 new church plants a year, is that God keeps giving really beautiful gifts to his church, pastors who are uniquely suited to do the work. And so I just want to remember that all the time. And with that in mind, then, to think about how we equip guys to do the work, and how do I equip myself. So as the culture shifts, I think what we need to constantly be wrestling with as pastors, first of all, is how do we communicate the gospel effectively to people today, which is different than it was 10 or 15 years ago. So it's hard to imagine that, and I'm not doing this to get us in political water so much, but when President Obama ran for office his first time, he was still supporting the Defense of Marriage Act, that marriage was between one man and one woman, and that was codified in law. And in 2008, almost everybody on both sides of the political aisle supported that still. That's how much things have changed in 14 years, that we now feel like even on that issue, we're swimming way upstream. And so what does that mean? It doesn't mean more political fighting. It means that we have to go back to the basics, about teaching the most basic things about who our God is and how he's designed his world. And that's true about the gospel as well. For 150 years or more in the United States, we were in what you might be able to describe as a Christian culture, where most of the people you talked to about the gospel had a basic biblical foundation underneath that you were building on. And now we can't assume that. we're talking to all sorts of people who know nothing about the Bible and about our God. And so that means going back to the beginning and speaking in simple ways about the truth of the gospel, what it means that I follow Jesus, who my God is, and what he requires of me. And so we're going back to the very basics. So in some ways, I think we have to learn how to communicate the gospel so clearly to our 4 and 5-year-olds in church, because that prepares us for evangelism, because that's where most people are. They're at the same place as our 4 and 5-year-olds who, are first learning the gospel in the most basic ways. And that's what evangelism is at the moment, is going back way to the beginning and learning how to speak simply. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Uganda, had the privilege of going there, and with Altra Carrico, taught a marriage conference in Karamoja, where for 45 minutes, I had to explain God's design for marriage to people who don't speak the same language as I do, and culturally in a very different place than I was. And it was intimidating to do that, but it also reminded me that's kind of where we're at in the US as well. And so that's part of what I feel like I've learned is I've watched young pastors who are thinking really carefully about how to communicate the gospel clearly. You have some of them in the Presbytery of Ohio: Tyler Dietrich, Brad Peppo, Jeremiah Montgomery. These are pastors who've thought carefully about how to communicate the gospel from the very beginning to people who don't have a background. So that's part of what I've been thinking a lot about, is how am I going to do that in Columbus as I go back and do that in a local church. And I think too, with telling stories is learning how to tell our own story of what Jesus has done for me, and telling in a way that's not just telling the story, but it's explaining the gospel. So I've been thinking some recently about the beginning of the Gospel of John, at how many different people in the first 4 chapters meet Jesus. He explains to them something about the gospel, and they go to their friends and say, "Come and see." And the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 goes back to the village and says, "You need to come meet this Jesus, the Savior of the world, who just told me about my own life." And then crowds of people come. And toward the end of that chapter, it says that as Jesus explained the gospel to them, they responded by saying, "We believe not just because of what you told us, Samaritan woman, but now we've heard it from him." And that's something of what we're doing, is first of all saying, this is what Jesus has done for me. And then saying, let's go look at the Bible and say, what does Jesus say to you? Like, it's that basic. And I'm not sure we're always good at that, but we have to get better at it.
Yeah, you're right. And that's kind of where the culture is taking us, without compromising the gospel, but we have to deliver it in a way that the culture can hear it. So good. So let's talk about Columbus. Lord willing, Presbytery of Ohio approves the call. What's your engagement going to be in home missions and the Columbus market, and then really the broader Presbytery of Ohio?
Sure. So, you mentioned already, my call is as pastor of outreach and evangelism. Just a little bit about the Columbus church. This is a church with about 350 members. I'll be the 3rd pastor there, so it has a pastoral staff. And we're all sharing the pastoral work, but there are areas of emphases. And so mine will be evangelism and outreach. And hopefully down the line, we're praying, and the session's doing this, and the church is, that evangelism and outreach leads to church planting as well. So, the first thing to say is Columbus is a fast-growing city. It's now the 15th, I think somebody told me more than that, but my list that I saw, 15th largest city in the U.S. I read an article a year ago that said that it was the only large city north of the Mason-Dixon line that grew during COVID. So it's grown even when other places weren't growing. Which means that there are more people now than there were before who don't know Jesus and need to know Jesus in Columbus. And so part of my call is to both do evangelism, which I'm so excited to be able to do that in a specific way in a local congregation, but also to train the congregation in evangelism, to take them out and do evangelism, to think together and pray together as we seek to take the gospel to lost souls. And so I'm just so excited to think together with the congregation about where the Lord's given us opportunity. So you already have, Mike McCabe on campus doing really great work, and other people in the church who've invested in campus ministry and a campus Bible study over a significant amount of time. But it's also a church that has footholds in various parts of greater Columbus. And so I want to think with folks, especially in areas where there are a group of families who already live in a place that's not, that's 20 minutes away from the church or 30 minutes away from the church, to think, how do we reach the place where you live with the gospel? And so I don't know what that looks like yet. I mean, I have ideas of what it might look like, but some of it is kind of figuring out with people, what are they most comfortable in doing? So, I mean, I have thoughts about Christianity Explored and, a variety of ways to help people reach their neighbors, where I'm alongside them, but I'm not necessarily always the one doing it. Part of it is equipping folks to share their faith with their neighbors. And so part of it is just saying, where has the Lord already put us? I remember vividly, and you guys had this with Eric Hausler a couple years ago when he came and did a conference for your presbytery. One of the things I vividly remember Eric saying to church planters was, you don't necessarily need new contacts, new people, because you already have those people. What you have to think about is the people that you are already in contact with. How do we share the gospel with them? And so I feel like that's part of my role, is helping people think about who do they already know and how do we share the gospel with the people they know. And so to me, I mean, this is the kind of thing that excites me. Contact with new believers, relationships where you get to share the gospel. And then as God saves these unbelievers and brings them into the church, to disciple them and help them grow in their understanding of the gospel, and for them to become evangelists, if you will, as they share the gospel with others. Like, that's really a big piece of what I see my specific area of focus to be in the church, while also doing all the normal things of preaching and discipleship and helping with small group ministry and all those kind of things, but then having this evangelistic focus to my ministry.
Good. So let's wrap it up. How can we, as the church watches this, how can we be praying for you in this transition period?
Yeah. First of all, you can pray for my family. It's we're also at kind of a transition point. I was thinking about this actually just this week, that in 2021, in part because of COVID, but we have 5 kids and all 7 of us were living in the same house. And now we've had 2 kids move out since 21, one more who's going to move out next year. And we're moving to Columbus as a family of 3 or 4. And so there's a lot of kind of moving parts to that and changes for our family. So we'd appreciate prayers for that transition. And I think, you could pray for Grace Church. Like, this is, a change in pastoral structure, as far as having pastors that share the ministry, but also have particular areas of focus. I think we're excited about it, but I would guess that there's also some, just wondering, like, what is this going to look like? It's going to be different. And so you can pray about that, but I think also pray, like, I got the sense in the time that I've spent with the folks there, that there's a genuine excitement from the oldest folks in the church down to the youth group, probably even lower than the youth group, but the youth group, like, I had kids in the youth group when I was there candidating saying, you're not just going to train the adults, right? You're going to train us to do evangelism and help us talk to our friends and our neighbors about the gospel. And so I think there's a genuine excitement about the possibilities of sharing the good news and seeing what the Lord might do. And I don't know, there's nothing better, I think, in ministry than seeing new believers baptized, and the joy both in those new believers, but also in the church, to see the things that we know to be true about our God and about the gospel on display in our congregation. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how the Lord blesses that. And so just pray for all of us that we'd have a real zeal and joy in sharing the gospel.
All right. Well, John, thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you. If not before, we'll see you in October at the Presbytery meeting.
That's great. Thanks, Mike.
God bless.